to the new series that we are starting with Professor Ronnie Lessem. It is all about his work, and especially the integral four worlds. This would be a thematic series where we'll be explaining social innovation from an integral four worlds perspective, and how Professor Ronnie Lessem and Alexander Schieffer and Arkham, thank you for being here. So can you explain to us that you talk about social innovation, societal regeneration, and also the genius or the DNA of a society. So whose role do you think it is to work on repairing, renewing, and also healing the society? So starting from your own integral four worlds, as you've traveled the whole world, can you maybe start from there and tell us why is it so important to you and to us collectively?
Okay, thank you, Anika. And let's start with, if you like, the paradox calling me a professor. And in a way, a professor gets in the way of social innovation, which I will reveal why that is, because if we start with the idea of where can social innovation happen, it has to happen across borders, across boundaries on the interstices. So it can happen with no individual in isolation of community, in isolation of organization, in isolation of society. So one aspect of the integral, which we call it the transpersonal, is that it needs to cross individual, organization, community, and society. So that's, if you like, the first reference point. So I can't just remain a professor. I have to be part of a community, part of a society, and part of an organization. So if you like, the social innovation in the integral perspective is informed by four trans perspectives, and I've explained what is the first. It has to cut across all of these elements. And of course, that's not easy because we're not used to doing that. Academe tends to function in isolation. Industry tends to function in isolation. We have to cross those divides. The West dominates the world, so each society doesn't have its voice. The second element of social innovation is that it needs to cross particular societies. When I say cross particular, I mean both. First, we have to identify the particularity of a society, what and I call the soul force. What is the soul force of that society? Be it in Pakistan, be it in Jordan, be it in Southern Africa. What soul force are we actually building on? And to that extent, we need to connect one soul force with another, because no one soul force is capable of bringing about social innovation in itself. But equally, if that soul force is not identified and articulated, for example, in South Africa, they talk about Ubuntu. Ubuntu is a soul force of a Southern African society. Unless it is revealed and brought out and crossed with other soul forces, we won't have social innovation. So that is the second element, what we call the transcultural. And I would say that is the most hidden element. That is the element which is missing from most work on so-called social innovation. They don't take into account particular culture and context. The third one, which we bring in, is the most obvious and the most acknowledged, which is transdisciplinary. But it's not easy to do. You need to work with anthropology, with psychology, with sociology, even with physics and economics and political science. In technological innovation, this is well accepted. You can't be a technological innovator if you don't know your physics or your biology or your biochemistry. But in social innovation, we don't need to know any of these things. We just to be clever dicks, right? Now, this to us is a nonsense. You need to be deeply engaged with all these different disciplines, and of course work in a cross-disciplinary way, remembering that each of these disciplines has an exogenous and an indigenous element. Now that's a difficult one. We don't just take disciplines a la defined by France or Germany, Britain or America. We need to reach into, if you like, those forces within a particular society. So that's the third element. The most important of all, and the keynote of our work through TCA, is the transformational. And for the transformational, we have what we call our gene. Now, that sounds very simplistic, what we call a transformational gene. What we mean is it needs to be grounded in particular soils locally. It needs to emerge locally, globally. It's not enough just to be grounded in the soil of Jordan or Singapore. It needs to then locally, globally emerge. As we move from the local to the local global, we move more from the natural to the transcultural. That in itself is an important task, but then we need to take a next step. We say from the local to the local global to the newly global. The newly global is the way in which we as a society, as an organization, as a context, take what is homegrown to ourselves and make it accessible to the world as a whole. So it's not just the Western world, but all worlds need to move into that newly global phase, the same way as the Japanese in manufacturing moved into the Kaizen kind of field and lean production. That was their version of newly global. And then you go into the final stage of the global local, which we call the transformative effect. So you go from local nature, local global culture, then you move into science and technology, and finally economy. Now that sounds overly simplistic, but in a sense, that is, if you like, our keynote. If you don't work through that genetic form, you will never get there as far as we are concerned. So that is the transformational element of social.
So can I stop you here, please? Because just to also simplify it for people who are listening to this for the first time. So rather than starting as, the common adage is that think global and act local. But we are reversing it. We are saying start from your local grounds. And what is the particularity, the soul force, the vitality of your land, your place, your community? Start from there. That is the main essence, right? And then match it up with what the global trends are, say, for example. And then you create a new form of knowledge. This is about knowledge creation. And then we come to the, as you say, West, or transformation then takes place. So can you also then explain your four worlds? This is the social innovation and the four realms you've explained. I will show the diagrams as well so people can understand this.
So two things to connect what Anika is saying and asking. Firstly, the full, if you like, formula is feel local, intuit local global, think global, and act global local. Right? So that, in a sense, is the transformation of the think global, act local. Then where do the four worlds come in? Each part of the world has all worlds contained within it, each part of the world, except there will be greater emphases of one world rather than another. So what are these worlds? We identify the South with, if you like, nature and communality, right? So if you like, that is a world which is full of human feeling, right? But that doesn't mean that Southerners only feel, they think and they act and they intuit, all of these elements. But nature and community will come most easily to those of us close to the ground in that kind of context. As we move to the East, and we recognize, generally speaking, we identify the East with spirituality, whether it's the Middle, the Near, or the Far East, are the sources of the major religions that came in the world, and that deep spiritual cultural impulse, which doesn't mean the South and the North don't have those impulses in themselves. Certainly they do. It's just that they tend to be most pronounced, in our view, in the East. When you come to the North again, it's that scientific technological impulse, which is particularly strong in that part of the world. Of course, today we find the Far East, for example, is coming up with a lot of developments in science and technology. But it tends to be developed by people who have been to universities in the North and the West. So it still tends to be something that the North and the West plays a predominant role. We would argue too predominant a role, because each world needs to develop all worlds, but that is a tendency. And of course, when we talk of the West, incidentally, we talk much too loosely of the West. We include what we call the North. To us, Norway and Scandinavia is northern. It's not Western. But anyway, in broad terms, the West, which we identify most strongly with America and the UK, is about enterprise and economy. And certainly, if you study economics or you study management, you will by and large anywhere in the world study a Western curriculum because of that strength in economics, which in a sense becomes a point of default as well, because it's
Mm,
overemphasized because of the strength of that part of the world. So this is, and then of course that leaves open, and our most recent work has been on the center. The center ground is regionally the center of the world, MENA, Middle East, but
mm,
of course it's beyond regional because each world actually has its own center, but it's most pronounced at the crossroads of civilization. The center stage, the Middle East, the MENA, has been for many, many centuries the crossroads of civilization.
mm,
All of these worlds then have their place. They need to develop their distinctiveness. They need to express that transformational distinctiveness by going through the transformational cycle, by rubbing shoulders with other circles, and by rubbing shoulders with different disciplines, and by crossing different sectors.
yes. So your journey has been about 50, 40, 50 years, I think not 40, 50 years of emphasizing on this the particularity of a place and the vitality of a place, and how we can then we should build on that. Societies should build on that soul force, but it gets lost. And this is what you are working on nowadays. And if we compare that to what you are writing in parallel to how the IBs, or the theory of knowledge, which is kind of established again in the West, and that has been applied to many societies. I mean, it's even in Pakistan, IB schools, and it becomes like a trend, a global trend that people follow. So what do you say against that, the work you are doing now? And you are actually calling it knowledge creation and value?
Yeah.
Yes.
So
Can
a
you tell
couple
us
of things.
about that? What
The
is the
first,
need for that?
yeah, the first thing is, as Anika indicates, that my own life story has kind of dictated the pattern of development in our work, and that I come from Africa, from Zimbabwe. So in many ways, my first port of call was Africa, and the dynamics of Africa, the soul forces of Africa, how they are brought to bear. And incidentally, the keynote of our work, generally speaking, is at what we call the meso level. It's not the micro, it's not the macro, because the micro is too small to have great influence, and the macro, frankly, is pretty well stuck all around the world. The
Yeah.
real development is at that intermediate level. So we work with enterprises like Sechem in Egypt, like Cashbuild in South Africa, like MedLabs in Jordan, like Mondragon in Spain. With that meso level, we work with them in a sense to give, in a sense, expression to social innovation. So it started in Africa, but given that my parentage is Central European, it's Lithuanian and Austrian, my next port of call was Europe. Of course, I live in Europe, so that's another reason for venturing into Europe. I was educated in America at Harvard Business School. That drew me to the West to discover the dynamics of the West. And one of the reasons Anika and I work together is I've always been drawn psychologically to the East, philosophically and spiritually, and that's what drew me to the East. So the kind of succession was starting south, going north, gravitating towards the East and the West, and what Anika is now asking, finally rediscovering the center. Now, what does it mean to rediscover the center? It means that the crossroads of civilization, and here we come to the point of knowledge and value creation, were not only the peoples of the book, because that is fairly evident. The peoples of the book came from the center. But the peoples of the book actually were operating within a crossroads zone. They were not only cross-fertilizing with each other, which is the irony of today's world where we are so separated from each other, but the Jews, the Christians, and the Arabs in the formative days, in the golden ages, very much worked together with each other, but also they worked very closely with the ancient Europeans, the Greeks, with the Persians, right? Even across to the Far East. So there were that kind of crossroads. So it wasn't only the peoples of the book, it was the crossroads civilization. And all, in a sense, great works come out of crossroads, right? They come out of civilizations cross-fertilizing with one another. So in recently entering into the zone of crossroads, which is specifically, most particularly Tunisia, Egypt, Jordan, Palestine, Israel, Iran, Persia, Kurdistan, into those countries. We're trying to uncover what knowledge and value creation has emerged historically out of those crossroads and how they might be brought to bear in the current era, both through enterprises, because we work with many enterprises in that region, but also, as Anika is pointing out, through schools and universities. The most difficult nut to crack, we have to say, is the universities. The universities are the most hidebound of all, but nevertheless, we never give up. But we also work with schools as well as enterprises at different grounds for knowledge and value creation and social innovation, most recently in the center ground to supplement Southeast, North, and West.
So in the notes that the summaries you're writing, I was reading that. So the state, the nation state is the culprit here. Would you say that? Because before it was the cross-cultural value creation and knowledge transfer as well. But once the nation state was established, that killed all that, what was very rich, heritage, common heritage of mankind. What would you like to say about that?
Well, that's a very powerful point that Anika is raising. And when most people think of MENA in the Middle East, they think of the peoples of the book. And certainly that is very significant, very important. But the other major vantage point of that part of the world, that crossroads, is that hitherto in the days of empire, for all the ills of empire, the positive side of empire is different cultures, different societies rubbed shoulders with each other. And even within the Islamic world, as Anika knows very well, there was something called the dhimis. The dhimis, in a sense, a state within a state, right?
Yeah.
And to me, and this has been written up by historians, which I've been reading of late, that in a sense, this whole nation of a transnational state was really in the bloodstream of that part of the world. And that got kind of killed off for two reasons. The one is, if you like, the Western nation state, which came along and trampled on those transnational grounds. And the other is the very parochialism of that part of the world, which in its own turn stamped on that transnational ground and in its place became, in a sense, very insular and so on. So those two forces got in the way of that innate transnationality, which is very particular to that MENA part of the world, and has been brilliantly articulated by a series of people ranging from the Iranian-American Hamid Dabashi and his work on worldly cosmopolitanism, Edward Said, the great Palestinian-American, what he calls traveling theory, crossing different zones, the great Abdullah Öcalan from Kurdistan, who's talking about democratic confederalism. Even if you like Ibrahim Abulish from Egypt, he talks about the economics of love, which crosses different boundaries because love crosses different boundaries. So that more transnational for us is linked with an associative perspective in economics. We reject profoundly conventional, competitively based, liberally based economics as particular to one part of the world, the West. If you move out of the West and you move innately and deeply into MENA in the Middle East, you find this associative ground. And we're building on it both politically and economically and culturally.
Okay, so I'll repeat my question again. And I think, as I said, these would be thematic lectures. Maybe next time we can review starting from Ibn Khaldun and Asabiya, because if we are starting center stage, then we're talking about social sciences. So he was the father of sociology from that region, MENA region. So we can start thematically with that. But one final question for this session before we start is that whose role is it how do you see whose role is it to rebuild and work or heal societies or work on the theme that you are, very passionately you express yourself time and again? Is it the university, the organizations that you and I have worked with? They all play a role, we believe that it's, it's, of course, it's transdisciplinary and transcultural as well. But nobody's doing this work. Whose role is it to work on this?
That's an extremely important question that Anika is raising, and maybe a good sort of last question for the session, because as Anika says, nobody's playing this role. And our argument is, and this, of course, is particularly poignant at the moment, is that for the phenomenon of what's happening, say, in Russia and the Ukraine, is because there's really nothing to stop it, right? These are the kind of perverse dynamics of a society, and nothing gets in the way of it. No political establishment, no economic establishment. We have given birth in the past 3-4 years to the notion of what we call a communiversity. Now, if you think of a communiversity, you immediately think of a university. And of course, a university does have a part to play. To our mind, in the ideal world, a university should be a catalyst for the regeneration of a society. But no university is able to actually do that, but they should play a part in that. So what we're talking about is a new configuration which links together communities, what we call learning communities, elements of university, elements of what we call laboratories, which is basically socioeconomic enterprises with a transformative impulse, and the most quintessentially university-like research academy, whose role it is to create that intellectual architecture born out of the indigenous soil, working its way through the gene process, which can actually navigate the kind of regeneration we're talking about. So those different parties come together to do what nobody else is doing in society.
Thank you for that. So given the fact that we are not bound with, physical presence nowadays, especially with IT playing its role, so it could be, and with a communiversity, it's not just a physical entity. It could be an online collaboration with different entities. And this could be our call to invite people to join forces with us, and we can take this further. Thank you for today.
Okay, thank you, Anika.